Hello, and welcome to Overcoming Polarisation, Paths to Common Ground, a podcast series from Debating Europe, Friends of Europe's Citizen Engagement Unit. Let's face it, Europe is feeling fractured. Whether it's politics, climate, tech, or trust in institutions, more and more people are feeling left out, unheard, and uncertain about the future. But what if we could flip the script? What if instead of fueling division, we looked for common ground? In this series, we're diving into the real issues behind polarization, economic inequality, climate anxiety, digital disruption, and bringing together voices from across the spectrum. We're talking policymakers, activists, business leaders, and most importantly, citizens' voices via our latest study, Voices for Choices. We're not just talking problems, we're exploring solutions that are fair, inclusive, and built to last. So, if you're ready to hear thoughtful conversations that go beyond the headlines and into the heart of what's dividing us and what could bring us back together, stick around. This is Overcoming Polarization. Let's get started. As usual, I'm your host, Sabina Shanku, and this is the last episode for which I'll be teaming up with my former colleague, Katarina. Katarina spoke to Chloe Mikolajczak, who's an environmental and social justice activist bridging European policy and grassroots organizing, about the things that we do wrong in engaging people in drawing up climate policy, and of course, some of the things that set examples and could really make a change in the future. I sat down to speak with Graham Smith, who's a professor of politics at the University of Westminster, about climate assemblies and how those work and how those could change the way that we engage with policymaking and with each other. As you can tell, this episode is about the way that people contribute to drawing up climate policy. We'll have another episode later on about policy that comes from above and how to draw that up better. But now let's look around us and see what we could do. We'll start with Katarina's interview with Chloe, as I said.
So let's talk about climate policy. As you know better than anyone else, this is something that usually comes from the top of governments and at the heights of the Parlement. But it's also undeniable to say that communities and citizens do have a role to play in shaping what we like to call the green future. In what ways do you actually see this being possible?
We can see that they've got a massive role to play, and we can start with the backlash, right? So the sort of when communities actually rise up against some regulations that are imposed to them. And if we just take the example of the yellow vest, for instance, that was, a climate regulation on paper, at least it was a tax on fuel, and it affected communities, and they rose up, and eventually the tax was withdrawn. So when it affects them and when they feel like they haven't been consulted and when they feel like there's, it's unfair to their livelihood, communities do rise up. And I think we've also seen that with the farmers, for instance, that they're opposing some regulations that they feel are unfair to them. So communities can definitely rise up and participate in decision-making when they feel like decisions are affecting them in an unfair manner. But they can also take part at different stages. And I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that communities do take part in the Commission's consultation process, because that, let's be honest, would be a massive lie. And if you look at the consultation process, when you open a random one, well, first of all, what I'm always surprised by is that there's very few answers. Like usually it's in the hundreds, sometimes in the few thousands. And then it's mainly very professionalized organization like business association, trade unions, NGOs, but very rarely, your neighbor from down the street who's going to take time to fill a commission consultation. So I think on that point that there's a problem. There's a very big democratic problem. But when they're aware of some regulations that are coming because it's affecting their livelihoods, because it's affecting their health, because it's affecting their future, communities can rise up as well. And I think sort of the missing link, and maybe I'm preempting a next question, but is the fact that these policies exist and they're being developed are communicated to people. And just to give you my personal experience on that, when I share to my community that, a policy is being developed and, they've got an opportunity to submit their thoughts or to actually fight against it or to call out a specific decision makers, people do participate. Like people do want to get involved. It's just that a lot of the time they don't have the information and they don't have the tool to do so.
Indeed, the work that you're doing specifically on social media, of your videos and your series, for example, of Meet Your Lobbyist, it's such a great example of an individual that saw a problem and decided to take matters into our own hands. And I do want to encourage everyone listening to just follow you on LinkedIn and check out your videos, because they are truly amazing. But I also want to as much as possible for this conversation to be inspirational. And, I shared you as an example, but I also want to know, what other good examples do you see of people doing the good work? Like, who else is out there that is inspiring you?
Oh, so many people. And a lot of the time, the people that inspired me the most are not necessarily the frontline people that you're going to see in like media articles or rankings of the most influential people or very big on social media. Because you did mention social media, and that is definitely a part of what I do. But a big part of what I do is also not online mobilizing. It's actual on the ground mobilizing, talking to communities, putting them in touch with each other, giving them the tools to do some organizing in real life. And I think that's probably the most important part of the work. So to answer your question, I think the people that inspire me the most are people, I might give you their names, but you wouldn't necessarily know them. It's the trade unionists that I see in the meetings that I sometimes attend. It's the teachers that do take the time to organize against austerity measures in Belgium. It's the climate activists in Germany that set up a campaign with the trade unions for public transport to ask decision makers to put more money into public transport. It's all of these links of the chain that end up affecting policies, because they build communities and they build bridges between communities. And these people are probably the most inspiring to me, because a lot of the time they do attend these meetings and they do these strategies after long hours at work already. So yeah, they're pretty freaking incredible. But one concrete example of that work is, for instance, a French NGO that is called Banlieue Climat, and that does amazing work at raising awareness and organizing youth from low-income neighborhoods on environmental and climate issues. They do a really fantastic work. And then, for instance, I'm thinking about all the activists and the organizers in the UK that fought against the Cambo oil field. So that includes Michaela Loach and Tori Choi and a bunch of others. But yeah, I mean, there's too many names to answer that question.
And so, speaking of bottom-up efforts or grassroots movement, it was actually interesting that at the start of the conversation, you mentioned the yellow vests in France, because that specifically was actually targeted around, it was a movement against the raising taxes on fuel, which I would say that perhaps it's a measure that you would be actually would support. In what other ways do you see that grassroots movements can actually contribute to a greener future? How do you see that actually happening in practice?
Yeah, so just to answer your point on the whole whether we support a tax on fuel, I think I totally understand why people rose up against this, because there's loads of places in France where public transport is non-existent and the infrastructures are non-existent. So when you don't have a choice to use your car, you use your car. When times are tough, you can't afford to pay, even if it's a few more cents at the gas station. So before we get to that point, which is a tax on fuels at the gas station, the first step is definitely to actually tax the big boats, basically, that currently are not taxed. There's a fuel exemption for the shipping industry and the flight industry. So let's start by taxing these two sectors, and then we can start talking about taxing citizens. On how communities can shape up decision making. Oh, there's plenty of ways. There's plenty of tools in the toolbox, thankfully, that we can use. There's obviously advocacy. So talking to the decision makers that are in charge, meeting with them, providing them with your lived experiences, because a lot of the time these decision makers talk a lot with experts or academics, for instance. But it's not that often that they end up discussing with people who have lived experiences of the policies that they're working on. So I think that's a crucial aspect. And then, of course, you've got the organizing that needs to happen, and the organizing and campaigning, even though they don't mean the same thing. And that means organizing within a group, because as a single person, it's very unlikely that you're going to be able to influence policy. But if you organize as a group, whether that's in your sector, in your line of work, group of neighbors, groups of people from a certain place, group of people asking the same thing, then that's when you start having a lot of power. And so you can do that through various tools. Obviously there's petitions, there's online calling out, there's in-person meetings, there's in-person protest, there's really loads of stuff. There's even civil disobedience, if you want to do that. So thankfully, we've learned from years and years of social movements, of success of social movements. We've learned tactics. Obviously, we constantly need to adapt to the current political context because we're not in the same situation that we were 5 years ago. But there's loads of stuff out there that have proven their efficiency. So thankfully, we're not left out in the dark.
And to your first point, which I completely understand and I completely agree that it was a completely missed opportunity on taxing the right people. It brings me to one of what I would like it to be the big focus of our conversation today, which is about how inclusive the climate movement actually is. Who gets to participate? Who is left out? What are your thoughts on this?
That's a big question. And I think for a very, very long time, the climate movement wasn't inclusive at all, whether it was in who was making up the climate movement or in the types of demands that were being pushed. It was a very privileged, let's put it that way, very like white bourgeois privileged movement for a very long time, and not really tackling the root of the issue and suggesting solutions such as, recycling and cycle more and eat a little bit less meat. A lot of very individualistic proposals where we know that in order to actually deal with the ecological crisis, because climate is only one part of the ecological crisis that we currently facing, we need to tackle the root of the issue, which is an economic system that is based on exploitation of both humans and nature. And these are two faces of the same coin. So for me, it's really difficult to talk about one and not the other. And I think for a long time, the movement was sort of guilty on that. And thankfully, it's starting to realize and shift its gears and shift its demands, which is great to see. But yeah, in terms of demands, I think it was very privileged and disconnected, which probably led to why there's been a sort of backlash and a lack of massive support for these demands. And then it's also in who makes up, this movement, who has the voice, who is able to speak out, who is able to talk to these decision makers. And a lot of the time we're faced with the same problem. We're faced with people who are professionalized in doing this and doing this and they're very good people and they do fantastic work and they're experts. But it goes back to what I was saying before. We do lack a lot of the time the voices of the people that are actually affected. And I think that was also a big problem and why a lot of people still see environmentalism and the environmental movements as something for privileged people who can afford to protest, who can afford to, take part in this movement and push those demands, when it shouldn't be. It should be a very inclusive movement, but there's still a lot of work to do. And that requires a lot of self-reflection. It requires decentralizing ourselves quite a bit, which is definitely a learning curve for a lot of organizations and a lot of people. And some are not going in the right direction, but some are doing the work and some are going in the right direction, if you ask me as an individual person. But you could ask someone else who could have a very different perspective.
Yeah, on that note of who can afford to participate in this movement, one could argue that, no one really can afford not to take part in climate action and at the very least being aware and participate. But afford here can truly take two meanings. Afford in the sense that actually having the mental energy at the end of the day to get informed, to read a petition, to sign a petition, to take part in protests on your weekend. So all that in all that sense of affording to take part, but also in the very narrow sense of affordability. So when we're talking about eco-friendly products, it's true that capitalism really is profiting from putting the blame and the burden of climate change on individuals, consumers, and they are 100% profiting from it. And I want to bring to the conversation now a report that Debating Europe, which is the citizens engagement unit of Friends of Europe, launched earlier this year. It's called Voices for Choices. They surveyed over 2,000 citizens across 7 European countries, and over 70% of the respondents say that eco-friendly products or services are too expensive. I mean, it is true that if you Google eco-friendly alternatives for my bathroom, you will be inundated with ads from all these fancy products. But is affordability really that big of a barrier when it comes to making environmentally friendly choices? Or is this just a lie that has been sold to us?
Oh no, it's a massive barrier, especially when we are in a cost of living crisis and people struggle to pay rents and to heat their homes and to put food on the table. I mean, I don't know if you've recently bought olive oil, but every month, I personally have a conversation with my best friend where we discuss the moment when we're going to have to buy a bottle of olive oil because it's so freaking expensive that every month we always have the same sentence. We're like, we're going to have to sell a kidney if we're going to continue buying olive oil. The prices have gotten absolutely insane. The electricity bill that comes every month. Thankfully, we've had milder winters than usual, but it's terrifying. When I look at my electricity bill, I'm like, oh, I have to pay that much, but that is insane. And I consider myself a pretty privileged person. So imagine for those who are less privileged. So yeah, massive barrier. And this comes down to the need for regulation. You know, I saw a documentary a few years ago where a professor at an American university had a very good point. It's like, why do we have to pay more for products that are good for people's health and that are good for the environment, and we have to pay less for basically crap that are bad for the environment and that are bad for people's health? It always comes down to externalities and the fact that externalities are not included in the final cost. And that requires strong, ambitious policy measures. Without that, and putting the burden of the responsibility on the consumer is incredibly unfair. It creates a sense of guilt. It creates a sense of split between people and opposition between people, between the ones that can afford it and the ones that cannot, when it should actually just be a basic right to be able to afford less bad for your health, less bad for the environment product. It should be a right that everybody has. If you zoom out and don't look at it just from an environmental climate perspective, I think the health angle is super important and is not discussed enough. Products that are super processed, that are full of pesticides, these are bad for your health. And ultimately, these are bad from an economic standpoint because the state is going to have to pay more to deal with your health issues because you've only been able to eat crap your whole life. So until externalities are not taken into account and included in the final cost, and until there's no strong policies to support people to make environmentally friendly choices, it's going to continue to be very difficult.
Can you maybe just, for the sake of your argument being understood, explain to our listeners what you mean by externalities?
Yeah, so externalities are basically the impact that a product or service has that are external and therefore not reflected in the cost. So let's say that you take, I'm not going to mention any brand, but you take a wooden table, very cheap wooden table, let's put it that way. You're going to have to cut a tree to make it. It's very simplified, but let's say you're going to have to cut a tree. And this tree has been storing CO2 and is also a home for various wildlife species. When you pay for your wooden table, you will not pay the cost of the CO2 storage that has been lost. You will not pay for the home of this wildlife that has been lost. You will likely not pay for the carbon emissions that were emitted during the transport of that tree or the manufacturing of that table. Possibly if the people who made your table do not have great working condition, that is also not something that is included in your final purchase. So that are externalities.
And that's probably also the reason why we can fly across the continent, return ticket for 50 euros, whereas a train ticket would probably cost 3 or 4 times more than that. And that same report of Voices for Choices, the respondents also showed high support for the European Union to, let's say, go back to prioritize green energy solutions and increase access to green energy solutions. Do you see that the institutions, specifically the EU institutions, that's the area where you work mostly in, are listening to citizens' calls of, actually wanting a proper fight against climate change?
Yes and no. I think there's a difference between people who work in the institutions, and I think there's some amazing people that work in the institutions, extremely smart, very driven. And then I think there's the political aspect. And what we're seeing now is extremely worrying. So what I mean by what we're seeing now is this deregulation drive and backtracking on some crucial regulations that were adopted in the last cycle and not even implemented. I think this is really important to mention. It's absolutely insane. We're basically reopening and weakening laws that were not even implemented. So if you take that into account, no, we're not listening to the concerns of citizens that want more climate action, because right now we're backtracking on climate action. And I think that's extremely worrying. And there's plenty of reasons for that. There's a very strong lobbying campaign from the industry, of some part of the industry, I should say, actually, because there's many businesses that are calling for these rules to be maintained as well. And there's a very strong political push by the more right-wing conservatives, as well as the far right, who is also calling, it's not even hiding, but the far right is basically now calling to scrap the Green Deal altogether. So if you look at these people, yes, they're definitely not listening to people's concerns. But I do think there's still some people that really want to preserve what we've adopted and what made Europe so proactive and a model on that front, at least for the countries around the world.
And now on to my interview with Professor Graham Smith. As we know, you have a particular interest in climate assemblies, which one might say is an alternative way for people to get involved in policymaking, especially on a topic that consistently ranks high, if not at the top of the list of priorities indicated by the young people who were consulted in our Voices for Choices study. Would you be able to tell us a bit more about what a climate assembly is, how it works, and maybe the most impactful one that you've seen?
Sure. So a climate assembly is a bit different from most forms of participation for 2 reasons. One is it uses democratic lottery to select participants, which means it's a form of random selection, and make sure that the group of citizens that you've got in the room resembles the wider population according to the characteristics you've chosen. So whether age, gender, ethnicity, education, that sort of thing. And the second thing is they go through a process of facilitated learning and deliberation to come to recommendations. And it's that combination of things, of the democratic lottery and the facilitated deliberation, that distinguishes it from other forms of engagement. If you think about kinds of typical engagement we're familiar with, if a public authority announces a consultation, it'll be already interested individuals, it will be organizations like your own that will respond. So it will be the people who already have very strong opinions about these issues. Or if you're thinking about, I don't know, engaging on social media, again, you'll just hear the loud voices. You'll just get those people who are already engaged, who may already be angry, so what this does is it brings a different type of input. And again, in the deliberation aspect means that people have learnt about the issue, they've heard different perspectives on the issue, and together they can come to a sort of reasoned agreement about about how to move forward. There's been about, depending upon how you define an assembly, there's been somewhere around 1,000 assemblies across the world. And Europe has been particularly active around climate assemblies in the last 5 or 6 years. My organisation, the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies, has estimated there's been around 200 climate assemblies being run at all different levels of governance. Most of them at local level, but there's been at least 15 at national level, and there's been a global assembly as well, which focused on climate. So it seems to be it seems to have caught both political and sort of activist imagination about how we could do politics differently.
And you'd mentioned at the beginning of your book, we need to talk about climate, how citizens' assemblies can help us solve the climate crisis. You speak about one of the most influential assemblies that took place in France. Would that be, let's say, an example? How did that happen, and what results did it have?
Yeah, I mean, actually, the French Assembly in many ways captures many of the issues around this emerging form of participation. It was probably one of the best resourced assemblies. It actually brought 149 citizens of France, or we use the word citizens, but it's actually residents of France, together over 8 weekends, which is a long period of time to be working together, and to produce recommendations on how it could achieve its Paris Agreement targets, basically. And because it was commissioned by Macron, by the President of the Republic, it had really high sort of political, there was a lot of political interest, a lot of media interest in it, probably more so than most other assemblies that have happened. So it kind of, and there was a lot of interest around activists at the time. And you have to remember politically at that point, I mean, he still is, but Macron was not popular. We'd just been after the Yellow Vest protests. So this was part of his response to that. And they came up with, as I say, 149 recommendations for changes to legislation, regulation, or referendum. The initial response to it was, actually, it had a great effect on sort of public debate, and it meant that politicians were having to talk about climate. But there was a lot of resistance to what they were saying, and there was a feeling that it had kind of failed because there hadn't been much policy impact. But we did a study about 3 or 4 years ago, looking at it 3 or 4 years after, and so we found that actually about 20% of what the citizens had asked for had been implemented, and about another 40% had been implemented, but in a modified form. So what had happened was the government hadn't really, if you like, embraced the full spirit of the assembly and kind of like its kind of systems change potential, but it had actually responded to many of the things that had been put on the agenda by the citizens. And so I think the French one is the most interesting because it was politically controversial. It had high political profile. And in many ways, it sort of started this wave of assemblies that have happened since. There have been other assemblies that have been more impactful in terms of more of their recommendations have had impact on policy. But there's not been one that, if you like, has been so politically central.
Again, in your book, you mentioned the fact that a lot of the participants felt like their work had been a bit of a waste of time, even though a lot of their policy suggestions had been sent on. And of course, it's not a binding consultation. It's sort of just getting the temperature of the population. But how would you fight this feeling of a useless battle among a lot of people?
So I think there's a number of reasons why many of the citizens who participated were disappointed. The first is, I think, that Macron made a promise at the start of there being no filter, which I think was interpreted by many people as saying that these ideas would be translated into policy, whereas I'm not sure necessarily that was exactly what Macron suggested, but he'd kind of set the expectations really high. The second is that it can take a lot of time for policy proposals to actually go through the system. And I think the French hadn't really thought hard enough about how to ensure that the follow-up was transparent so that people could actually see how the French state was responding to what the assembly suggested. And then I think the third thing is, it is true that the French government has cherry-picked, as in selectively chosen those proposals that it was particularly interested in. And I think one of the things we miss is if you just think an assembly is here's a menu of things menu of proposals you can choose, you can have this one or that one or that one, it's to miss the point that the assembly members actually produced a program of change.
That's completely understandable. But I think at least while they were writing up these proposals and having these discussions before political disappointment came into the equation, a lot of people experienced, let's say, an empowerment that within politics that they wouldn't normally have simply through electoral politics, through going to the polling station. Would you be able to give us a few more insights into how people feel taking part in such an activity?
The consistent thing we find from assemblies is that it has a transformative effect on the people who participate in them. It's highly significant numbers of people coming out the other end saying that this has been a really important experience for them, that they now feel more politically efficacious, that they want to engage more in politics, or that the issue has changed the way they think about politics. And it's not a surprise. Most of the people who come into an assembly have not been engaged in politics, maybe apart from voting. But this is not something that these are people for whom politics is something that they might observe occasionally, but they're not activists. So the first thing to say is these people come into the room, they're not sure they can do the work they've been asked to do. And that's really the first thing we notice, is that most of the people in the room are kind of wondering why on earth they've been invited to participate. Many of them have actually participated because they get an honorarium, because they're being paid, not because they necessarily are really interested in the subject. And we take a lot of care to make sure that we have that sort of diversity in the room. So not everybody's that interested in politics. And then they go through a process of learning and learning about each other, talking to people they've never talked to before, they would never come across before, because it's not like our polarized lives on social media and stuff. We're not talking to people like ourselves. We're talking to people in an assembly who are very different from us in a context of mutual respect. We're learning together. We're deliberating together. We're trying to find common cause. We're trying to figure out how we as an assembly think we can respond to this. No one's ever been asked to do anything like this before. And there's been some really fascinating work done in the UK on the people who participated in Climate Assembly UK, that found that 2 years after the assembly, those people were engaged in more pro-climate activity than they had been during the assembly. And their attitudes towards climate and climate action had really solidified. So it isn't something that, because you do this process and maybe you drop off afterwards. But actually what's really interesting is it seems to empower people over time as well.
That's beautiful. It creates a civic spirit that wasn't there before, and I assume bringing communities together as well. So could I ask, what kind of ideas do people come up with? What kind of policies do they put forward?
Well, the first thing to say is not everything they came up with, an assembly comes up with, will be totally original. I mean, most of us have seen kind of like, you can't imagine that people are just going to imagine 149 proposals that no one has ever thought of before. So that's the first thing to say. But what they do is they mix proposals and sort of bring things together in ways that would not be put together by other actors, by politicians who have got political party interests, by civil society organizations that have got particular advocacy positions that they won't, that they strongly hold, and other stakeholders, etc. So the first thing is they actually bring these things together in really, bring ideas together in clever ways. And actually the French Assembly, we've seen from some of the recent evidence we've been looking at, actually brought ideas that were not kind of mainstream, and sometimes brought those into the policy space. And so one of the ideas that the French Convention brought up, which has been partially implemented, which I thought was really interesting one, was the idea that you should not be able to fly internally within France if there is an alternative public transport mode that can get you there within 5 hours. So, and then the state has actually implemented that, but reduced the time to 2 hours. So if there's an alternative train that could do the journey within 2 hours, then there can be no internal flight between those two cities. And that was being proposed by kind of people outside the mainstream, but it was something the citizens brought out, and they brought it into the mainstream. So it's that sort of thing that they can do, is where they'll review the policy landscape and have a much more open. And I think the other thing which is really important here is they look at these proposals and they think about them based on their kind of lived experience. How would this work for someone like myself? But they're doing that around with other people from very, very different positions who have got very, very different perspectives. So you're not just thinking about, what's this like for someone like myself, who's a middle class, who's from the middle class, who kind of like has a stable home and kind of like has a stable family. But what about also for this person sitting next to me, who is a single mother, who lives in the city, who is, who only just gets enough money in order to feed her kids, and then someone over here who is, who's incredibly wealthy. And that's what's really interesting about this space, is it's a space where you're trying to think of policy solutions, recognizing the diversity of experience that's in the room.
Of course, it makes sense conceptually, but what I'm wondering is, how does it make sense in practice? How do these people coming from such different backgrounds overcome their differences and the inevitable disagreements that come up between each other?
Well, the first thing you do is you don't leave them alone, because if you put 149 people in a room, we can probably pretty clearly work out who's going to take on leadership roles quite quickly. Those people are most experienced, older people. You know the score, and men. So people like me, basically. And people who are confident. And so these are facilitated spaces, and those facilitators play a really key role in ensuring that speaking time is roughly equal, that people who, trying to work with, and one of the first things you do actually in an assembly is you typically set the rules for debate, for deliberation. So, if you're confident, step back. If you're not confident, step forward. These kind of give people space, listen, all these kinds of ideas. And those facilitators play a critical role. And I think what happens very quickly is these assemblies generate a spirit of fairness. It's very easy to talk about someone else when they're not there. It's very interesting to, kind of defend your interest without having to take someone's interest into account when they're not in the same space. But when they are in the same space, you've created a situation of respect. You've created a situation of listening and care for each other. Actually, people can work together and figure out what's right. And typically, these processes will really reflect on questions of fairness, and they'll reflect on those people who are potentially hardest hit. Assembly members are much more willing to propose things that will reduce consumption and reduce production. And they are much more willing to say that the state should regulate. And we've got good evidence to show that citizens are much more progressive than their governments on both of those accounts.
And I think it's interesting, something you said before about participants being paid an honorarium, because of course a lot of them have their own lives, there are things to do, and often their voices get silenced because they have all of these other things to do, as opposed to lobbyists whose entire job is to talk about this. So could you tell me a bit more about these practical aspects of making sure that people are able to participate?
Let's go back one step. The first thing people do is they receive a letter or a text or however it's done, which is basically saying to them, come and do this, come and get engaged in this process over a number of weekends and we'll pay you. And a lot of them look at it and go, this must be a scam. Because why would anyone want to pay me for doing this thing that I don't know anything about? So we've got to do a lot of work to persuade people that, no, this isn't a scam. And yes, we think that it's really valuable that you participate. So for those people who respond positively to the invitation, which is usually about 10 to 15% of the invitations that are sent out, it's really important that we put everything in place that means that they're not restricted to coming. So that means, for example, offering to pay them, because many people, first of all, because they're putting a lot of work in, they're it's taking up a lot of their time. And, this is a real civic contribution, and everyone else is being paid. Activists are being paid, most working for civil society organizations, civil servants are being paid. The people who are running the assembly are being paid. So, that's the first thing, an honorarium, which means you get people in the room who are coming because of the money and not necessarily the issue. And I'm happy with that. They wouldn't be there for other reasons. Second is to make sure that all the sort of childcare or other caring responsibilities is looked after. And then the third is some of these people are really not confident. Some of these people will have mental health problems, etc., and have real worries about their capacity to do this, and really spending time with them beforehand to actually persuade them that they can do this work. Once they're in the room, it's actually really pretty easy to keep them, if I'm honest. It's only things like, it's only sort of family problems and that mean that people tend to drop out. The retention rate on most of these, I mean, some are badly organized, let's be honest, but most of these is incredibly high, because once people are into the process, they realize they can really make a contribution. And I think that's what, again, differs from almost all other participatory processes, which requires you to give up your time with no recompense.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to reach out a hand, telling people I understand what you're going through, but I want you to sit with me on this anyway, and let's think about it together. To wrap up, I'd want to sort of take all of everything you've learned from observing these experiences and ask, in an ideal world where citizens' assemblies were widespread and properly integrated into policy making from all different topics, not just climate, how would society look like?
If this became much more of an everyday way of doing political work, it would just be something that, you receive it in the post. You say, what it means. There would actually be a right for you to do it, so that you would be able to take the time off from work, and your employer would be recompensed, etc. It would just become a natural way of doing politics. I think the way of thinking about it, and I've been thinking about this quite a lot, is what would it look like? It would look exactly like social media doesn't. It would actually mean that we create a space where we actually where we value diversity, we value listening to the opinions of people other than ourselves. And I think at the moment, that's that's such an unusual political space. So for me, what it would look like is it would bring a bit of sanity into our currently kind of insane media and sort of political environment, where people are having to respond so quickly to things they don't know anything about, and are kind of like moving into tribes and the kind of contestation and confrontation that we see all the time. So it would be creating a space that was different from that. Now, the interesting thing for me is, can those two things really coexist?
Yeah, and I think it's something that would really respond to people's needs. They feel very marginalized by mainstream politics. They feel inflamed by rhetoric on social media, alienated by other like classic mass media. I think it would be soothing. The young people in our reports and focus groups often say that they crave a way to get involved and be listened to.
Yeah. I mean that the interesting thing for me is not the creation of it is interesting, obviously interesting, the creation of lots of assemblies. For me, it's the creation of a political system where those assemblies have effect. And that's going to be the real challenge, which is making sure that we can get those established interests that don't want to see this sort of thing happen, actually out of the way, in order that they can have meaningful impact. Because what we don't want is a lot of these things happening in ways that, if you like, are soothing the population without any meaningful change.
Exactly. This would actually be a real step towards overcoming polarization and getting everyone on the same page moving forward together.
Yeah, young people are obviously selected into these assemblies in their proportion to the wider in terms of the wider population. Which means that you've got young people working with other people of other ages, obviously. So that's the first thing. So this is a if you like, an intergenerational process. But the youngest we get in assemblies is 16 typically. So we've got this issue of, we get young people, but they're not children and young people, if you like. So this has been responded to in a couple of ways, and also because young people tend to be a smaller proportion of the population than older people. Some people have asked this question about, actually, maybe we need to create other spaces. So we've actually started to see two things happen. One is we've started to see youth-only assemblies. So using democratic lottery to select assemblies that are only for young people, 25 and 16 to 25, if you like. I think there's one going on at the moment at the EU level, or just about to start, on pollinators. I know there was one in Estonia that was looking at the green transition. And what you're doing there is you're saying, okay, we want to bring together a diversity of young people, which isn't just you young activists, but the diversity of young. So that's one really interesting approach. The other thing I think we have seen is a couple of assemblies, adult assemblies, having parallel children and young people assemblies. The most famous of these at the moment has been in Ireland, where they ran a children and young people's assembly on biodiversity loss. And that was from the age of 7 to 16, which I thought was incredible, actually. And they worked with 7 to 16-year-olds in designing the process, but also delivering the process. And I think this is really exciting. And the person who's working in this area, Katie Reed, she obviously is pushing for these kind of children and young people's assembly. But she's made the argument of why not bring children into the adult assembly? Not just have them as separate, but actually, why isn't it 7 to 70? Why is it 16? And I think there's some really interesting issues here about, can we create spaces in which children and young people feel really, are comfortable to work with people across other generations. So we know it works from 16 and up. The interesting question now is, can we create these sort of intergenerational spaces?
Thank you so much to our two lovely guests for showing us not just the difficulty in getting people to engage with climate policy, but also shining a light as to some of the best ways forward with this. As usual, I'll invite you to engage with our podcast on social media. You can usually find us on LinkedIn and Instagram. Drop a comment there if anything in this episode piqued your interest. And you won't hear from me next week because we're taking a little break over the summer. But we'll be back in a few weeks with fresh forces and fresh voices, continuing our series on overcoming polarization, as well as dipping back into our regular Policy Voices episodes. So enjoy your summer, and I'll see you after we've all had a little well-deserved vacation.